The mop bucket hit the floor with a crash, dirty water spreading across the tile in a dark, spreading stain. Officer Chad Bennett stood over it, smirking, his boot still extended from the kick that had sent it flying. He thought he was humiliating a nobody, some quiet old man who pushed a mop around the precinct at night and never said a word back. He had no idea that the man kneeling silently to clean up the mess was Marcus Reed, a 20-year military police veteran and federal corruption investigator who had spent 3 weeks inside this building gathering evidence that would end careers, dismantle a criminal network, and burn Bennett's entire world to the ground. By sunrise, every badge in this precinct would answer to him. This is the story of a man who let himself be underestimated, and the reckoning that followed. Before we go further, comment below and tell me which city you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, now's the time, because this story only gets more intense from here. Marcus Reed was 45 years old, and for the past 3 weeks, almost nobody at District 12 Precinct in the city of Ashford knew his real name, his real rank, or his real purpose. To the officers who passed him in the hallway every night, he was simply Marcus, the quiet night shift janitor who emptied trash cans, mopped floors, and disappeared into supply closets without ever making eye contact for too long. What none of them knew was that Marcus had spent 2 decades as a military police investigator, rising through the ranks with a reputation for meticulous, patient work. He had investigated fraud in overseas commands, corruption in supply chains, and misconduct cases that other investigators were too afraid to touch. When he retired from active duty, the transition into federal and municipal internal affairs work felt natural. He had a gift, an almost unnerving ability to notice what others overlooked, and an even greater gift for being overlooked himself. That gift was exactly why Mayor Diane Whitfield's office had recruited him for this assignment. District 12 had a reputation that stretched far beyond Ashford city limits, a reputation for excessive force complaints that vanished before they reached a courtroom, for evidence that disappeared from lockup, for citizens who filed grievances only to be quietly discouraged, threatened, or ignored. 3 previous attempts at formal investigation had failed, shut down by a wall of silence that no outside investigator had ever managed to breach. So the mayor's office tried something different. They created a cover identity. Marcus would spend a month working inside the precinct as a low-level maintenance contractor, invisible, disposable, beneath notice, before officially assuming his real position as the department's new internal affairs chief. Nobody inside the building would know his true identity, except the mayor's chief of staff and one FBI liaison, Agent Rita Colson, who checked in with him through a burner phone every few nights. For 3 weeks, Marcus had pushed his cart down the same hallways night after night, and in that time, he had learned more about the rot inside District 12 than any file review ever could have revealed. He learned which officers came in reeking of alcohol before their shifts. He learned which supply closets were used for conversations that were never meant to be overheard. He learned the rhythms of the building, who arrived early to alter paperwork, who stayed late to move things out of the evidence room, who laughed a little too hard at jokes that weren't funny. The nervous laughter of people protecting secrets. He carried a small digital recorder clipped inside his uniform pocket, its microphone barely visible beneath the fabric. He wasn't record everything. That would have been reckless. But he captured what mattered. The moments when officers, believing themselves alone or unheard, said things they never should have said. Marcus had grown used to being invisible in rooms full of powerful men. It was, in its own strange way, one of the most valuable skills he had ever developed. People revealed themselves completely in front of someone they didn't believe was worth hiding from. And nowhere was that truer than at District 12, where the culture had curdled into something far uglier than simple bad behavior. A closed ecosystem of falsified reports, skimmed evidence, and a code of silence enforced by fear. Tonight, though, the invisibility was about to be tested in a way Marcus hadn't anticipated. Tonight, he would meet Officer Chad Bennett on one of his worst days, and Bennett would decide, without knowing it, to pick a fight with the one man in the building capable of ending him. It was nearly 11 at night when Bennett stormed through the precinct's rear entrance, his uniform rumpled, his face flushed with the particular anger of a man who had just been chewed out by a superior. He'd spent his shift failing to close out a case that should have been simple, and the watch commander had made it clear, in front of half the bullpen, that his performance had been sloppy. Bennett needed somewhere to put that anger. He found it in the quiet figure pushing a rolling cart down the hallway outside the break room. "Watch it," Bennett snapped, though Marcus hadn't come anywhere near him. Marcus said nothing, simply adjusted his cart to give Bennett a wider berth, his eyes down in the practiced deference of a man who had learned over 3 weeks exactly how invisible he needed to be. But deference wasn't what Bennett wanted tonight. He wanted a target. "You're always around, huh?" Bennett said, stopping in the hallway, arms crossed. "Every night. Same time, same mop. You ever do anything else with your life?" "Just doing my job, officer," Marcus said evenly, his voice carrying the flat, unbothered tone of a man who had absorbed far worse from far more dangerous people. "Your job," Bennett repeated, laughing without humor. "Man, how old are you? 45, 50? And you're pushing a mop bucket around a police station at midnight. No offense, but that's kind of sad, isn't it?" A couple of officers lounging near the break room door snickered. One of them, a younger cop named Diego Alvarez, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Marcus kept his expression neutral. Everyone's got a job to do. "Yeah, well, some jobs matter more than others," Bennett said, stepping closer, clearly enjoying the audience he was gathering. "You know what I do? I keep the streets safe. I put bad guys away. What do? Clean up other people's messes. Literally." "Somebody has to," Marcus replied simply. Something about the calm in his voice needled at Bennett more than any retort could have. He wanted a reaction. Fear, embarrassment, anger, anything. Instead, he got quiet composure. And that composure felt, in some way he couldn't articulate, like disrespect. "You know what?" Bennett said, his voice dropping into something meaner. "I bet you were probably in trouble a lot, right? Guys like you usually end up doing this kind of work because nothing else worked out. Couldn't hold down a real job, maybe did some time. That about right?" The comment landed exactly where it was designed to land. A lazy assumption, dressed up as an insult, built on nothing but the color of Marcus's skin and the mop in his hands. Marcus had heard versions of this 100 times over the years, in 100 different rooms, from men who mistook their badge for a license to demean anyone they decided was beneath them. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply looked at Bennett with an unreadable calm that, if Bennett had been paying closer attention, might have unsettled him far more than it did. "I've had a long career, officer," Marcus said quietly. "Longer than you'd think."
"Sure you have," Bennett said dismissively, already losing interest, already turning to head toward the locker room. As he passed, his shoulder clipped the edge of Marcus's cart, hard enough to send a bottle of cleaning solution clattering to the floor. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look back. Marcus bent down to retrieve the bottle, his fingers steady despite the tightness building quietly in his chest. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more focused. Filing it away, documenting it, adding it to the growing list. As he straightened up, his eyes drifted, almost by accident, toward the open door of the locker room where Bennett had disappeared. Inside, just visible through the gap, Bennett was shoving something into the back of his locker. A small manila envelope, thick with what looked like cash, quickly buried beneath a folded jacket. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his mind did exactly what 20 years of training had conditioned it to do. Noted. 2 nights later, the harassment escalated from careless to deliberate. Marcus was midway through mopping the corridor outside the briefing room when Sergeant Roy Pruitt rounded the corner, coffee cup in hand, trailed by Bennett and 2 other officers finishing up their shift.
Pruitt was a heavy-set man in his 50s, a 22-year veteran of the department who had built a small, loyal kingdom inside District 12. Men who owed him favors, men who feared crossing him, men who had learned that whatever Pruitt wanted quietly handled got quietly handled. "Look who it is," Pruitt said, spotting Marcus. "The mop man." Bennett grinned, clearly delighted to have an audience for round 2. "Hey, old man, watch this," he said, and without warning, deliberately bumped his shoulder into Marcus's cart, sending it careening sideways. The bucket tipped, spilling gray water across the freshly mopped floor, splashing across the hem of Pruitt's trousers. "Are you kidding me?" Pruitt barked, stepping back, shaking water off his pant leg. "What is wrong with you? You trying to ruin my uniform?" "Sergeant, I didn't—" Marcus started, his voice measured. "I don't want to hear it," Pruitt snapped. "You people are all the same. Can't do a simple job without making a mess of everything." The phrase hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. A couple of the officers behind Pruitt exchanged uneasy glances, but nobody said anything. "I'll clean it up, Sergeant," Marcus said, already reaching for the mop. "You're damn right you will," Pruitt said. "And you know what? I've had it with you skulking around here every night like you own the place, watching everybody, standing around corners. You think I haven't noticed? Chief's gonna hear about this. Maybe it's time we find somebody else for this contract." It was a threat, plain and simple. The kind of casual cruelty that came easily to men who had never once worried about losing their own jobs over how they treated someone they considered beneath them. "Yeah," Bennett chimed in, clearly enjoying himself. "We don't need somebody creeping around, going through drawers, looking at things that aren't his business." The comment caught Marcus's attention immediately, though his expression didn't shift. Going through drawers. An oddly specific accusation for a man who had, 2 nights earlier, been caught stuffing an envelope of cash into the back of his own locker. "I haven't gone through anything that isn't part of my job, officer," Marcus said calmly. "It's so," Bennett said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something more openly hostile. "Because I could have sworn I saw you near the evidence room the other night. What were you doing back there?" "Emptying the bins," Marcus replied. "Same as every night." "Sure," Bennett said, unconvinced, glancing at Pruitt. "Sarge, maybe we should have somebody keep an eye on him. I don't like it. Guy's acting suspicious." Pruitt studied Marcus for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, but the reflexive paranoia of a man who had a great deal to hide and had learned to be wary of anyone who lingered too long in the wrong places. "Clean this mess up," Pruitt said finally, turning to walk away. "And watch yourself. I mean it." Marcus knelt down and began mopping up the spilled water without a word, his motions slow and deliberate. Inside, he registered every detail of the exchange with the same cold precision he'd applied to interrogation rooms and crime scenes for 2 decades. The accusation about the evidence room, the paranoia in Pruitt's eyes, the specific defensiveness in Bennett's voice. They were nervous. Good men rarely got nervous over a janitor. Guilty men did. What Bennett and Pruitt didn't know, what nobody in District 12 knew, was that Marcus's late-night rounds through the building had never been random. Every trash bin he emptied, every hallway he mopped, every supply closet he restocked had been chosen with purpose, mapped out over 3 weeks into a careful, methodical survey of the precinct's
Weak points. In his small rented apartment across town, Marcus kept a locked file box containing everything he had gathered so far. Copies of documents photographed discreetly on his phone, transcribed fragments of overheard conversations, and a growing timeline of irregularities that painted a disturbing picture of institutional corruption stretching back years. The evidence room was the heart of it. Marcus had noticed early on that certain officers made repeated late-night trips there without any corresponding paperwork trail. Property logs showed items checked out for court dates that didn't exist. A drug seizure from a joint task force operation with the DEA showed a discrepancy of nearly a pound between the arrest report and the final weighed intake. The kind of gap that, in Marcus's experience, almost always meant product was being skimmed and resold. He'd found a ledger once, briefly, tucked behind a filing cabinet during a supposed deep clean of the records room. Handwritten columns of numbers next to initials he recognized. RP for Pruitt, CB for Bennett, and several others. He hadn't been able to photograph it before a returning officer forced him to abandon the room, but he'd memorized enough of the pattern to know exactly what he was looking at. This wasn't isolated misconduct. This was a functioning criminal enterprise operating inside a police precinct, protected by a code of silence and years of unchecked power.
Marcus understood, with the clarity of a man who had seen this exact pattern before in other departments, other cities, that dismantling something this entrenched required patience. A single arrest wouldn't do it. A single officer's confession wouldn't do it. It required documentation, corroboration, and, most importantly, the element of surprise. The moment District 12 realized an internal affairs investigation was underway, evidence would vanish, stories would align, and the whole rotten structure would simply retreat further into the shadows. That was why the mayor's office had insisted on the cover identity in the first place. That was why Marcus had spent 3 weeks enduring exactly the kind of casual cruelty Bennett and Pruitt had shown him. Because every insult, every dismissive glance, every assumption they made about the quiet janitor who surely didn't matter only deepened their blindness to what was actually happening under their noses. Late that same night, alone in his apartment, Marcus's burner phone buzzed with a text from Agent Rita Colson. Confirmed. Mayor's office is ready. You start officially tomorrow morning. 0800. Bring everything. Marcus
read the message twice, then set the phone down and looked at the file box on his kitchen table. 3 weeks of quiet, careful work about to detonate. Tomorrow, the invisible man would become impossible to ignore. His final night undercover fell on what should have been an unremarkable Thursday shift. Instead, it became the moment Bennett's cruelty finally crossed a line that would haunt him for the rest of his career.
Marcus was collecting trash from the break room when Bennett cornered him near the supply closet, flanked by 2 off-duty officers waiting to razz whatever entertainment Bennett had planned. "Hey, mop man," Bennett said, holding up Marcus's laminated contractor ID badge, which he'd apparently lifted off the supply cart. "This you? Marcus R. Facilities? Real impressive resume there." "Officer, I need that back," Marcus said calmly, extending a hand. Bennett smirked, holding the badge just out of reach like a schoolyard bully. "Or what? You gonna report me? Who exactly are you gonna report me to, huh? You're a ghost around here. Nobody even knows your last name. You think anybody's gonna care what happens to some guy who empties trash cans?" He tossed the badge into a nearby wastebasket with a careless flick of his wrist, laughing as it clattered against an empty coffee cup. "That's where you belong," Bennett said, "in the trash. Just like everything else you touch." The off-duty officers laughed. Somewhere behind them, Pruitt appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the show rather than stopping it. "I think it's about time we found somebody else for this contract," Pruitt said, echoing his earlier threat. "You're done here after tonight. Don't bother coming back tomorrow." Marcus bent down, retrieved his badge from the wastebasket, and wiped it clean against his sleeve with unhurried calm. He looked up at Bennett, then at Pruitt, his expression utterly unreadable.
"Tomorrow is going to be a very different day," Marcus said quietly. The line landed strangely in the room, too calm, too certain, carrying a weight that didn't match the words of a man who had just been humiliated and fired. For a fraction of a second, something in Bennett's chest tightened, an instinct he couldn't quite name. Then Pruitt laughed, breaking the tension. Yeah, sure it is, buddy. Get your stuff and get out. The other officers laughed along, and the moment passed. Marcus said nothing further. He simply gathered his cart, wheeled it toward the supply closet, and disappeared down the hallway without looking back. Bennett watched him go, an unexpected, unfamiliar unease settling somewhere he couldn't identify. The same instinct, buried deep, that every predator carries and occasionally ignores at exactly the wrong moment. Marcus finished his final rounds just after midnight, pushing his cart one last time down the corridor that led past the evidence room. He paused outside the door, studying the faint scuff marks on the linoleum where carts far heavier than his had been wheeled in and out at odd hours over the past several weeks. Tomorrow,
This door opens for me differently, he thought. He wasn't angry. That surprised him a little. 20 years in this work had taught him that satisfaction rarely arrived the way people expected it to. This wasn't about revenge against Bennett or Pruitt as individuals. Men like that were simply symptoms of something much larger, a culture that had been allowed to fester for years because nobody with real power had ever bothered to look closely enough. This was about the people who had been failed by that culture, the citizens whose complaints vanished, the officers too afraid to speak up, the young cop named Diego Alvarez who had flinched every time Bennett humiliated someone, but never found the courage to intervene. Marcus understood that fear. He'd seen it in 100 institutions before this one. Silence wasn't cowardice, it was survival, until someone with enough power and enough evidence finally made speaking up safe. Tomorrow, he intended to make it safe. He returned to the supply closet, gathered his cart one final time, and pulled the small digital recorder from his pocket, transferring its contents to an encrypted drive already loaded with 3 weeks of documentation. Then, he dialed the burner phone. Reed. Agent Coulson answered on the second ring. Confirming for tomorrow, Marcus said quietly. Evidence is compiled. I have enough for warrants on the evidence room discrepancies, plus testimony potential from at least one uniformed officer who's been uncomfortable with what he's seen. Copy that, Coulson said. Mayor's office will have the formal announcement ready at 0800. FBI liaison team will be staged 2 blocks out, ready to move once you give the signal. Understood, Marcus said. See you in the morning. He ended the call, set the phone down, and looked around the small apartment one final time. The file boxes, the photographs, the weeks of quiet, deliberate patience about to culminate in a single, decisive morning. Somewhere in the darkness outside his window, Ashford slept, unaware that its most corrupt precinct was about to be turned inside out by the one man everyone inside it had decided wasn't worth noticing. By 7:30 the next morning, District 12 precinct buzzed with a nervous energy that hadn't been present in weeks. Word had spread overnight through the department grapevine. A new internal affairs chief was arriving today, someone with real authority, someone sent directly by the mayor's office with a mandate to clean house. Officers who normally strolled in with coffee and casual conversation instead arrived early, uniforms pressed, desks hastily organized. In the break room, Sergeant Pruitt paced back and forth, barking instructions
at anyone within earshot.
I want that evidence room squared away before 8, Pruitt snapped at a junior officer. Anything that looks out of place, fix it now. And somebody find out what happened to the Ramirez file. It needs to match the intake report exactly. Bennett, for his part, seemed almost giddy with nervous energy, straightening his uniform in the mirror of the men's locker room, practicing a confident, professional expression. This could be good for us, Bennett said to Officer Diego Alvarez, who stood nearby, silent and unreadable. New chief comes in, sees us handling business, closing cases, staying sharp. Maybe I finally get that detective spot I've been asking about. Alvarez said nothing, his jaw tight.
He had watched Bennett humiliate the janitor for weeks, watched Pruitt threaten him, watched the casual cruelty pile up night after night with a growing, uncomfortable knot in his stomach that he hadn't known what to do with. He thought about the recorder Ben Collins had used in another story he'd once heard about. The courage it took to document wrongdoing quietly, patiently, without anyone noticing. He hadn't done anything like that. Not yet. But something about today felt different, and he couldn't shake the feeling. At exactly 7:50, Sergeant Pruitt gathered the morning shift into the bullpen for a hasty briefing.
"Listen up," Pruitt said. "New internal affairs chief starts today. I don't know much about him. Some outside hire. Mayor's office pushed it through fast. Whoever he is, we treat him with respect. We look sharp, and we do not, I repeat, do not, give him any reason to start digging where he doesn't need to be digging. Understood?" A chorus of muttered, "Yes, Sergeant," answered him. Bennett straightened his collar one more time, glancing at the clock. 8 o'clock. Any minute now. None of them noticed the black SUVs quietly pulling into the parking lot outside, or the small team of federal agents waiting inside them, watching the building with the patient stillness of people who had done this exact operation many times before. At exactly 8 o'clock, the double doors of District 12 Precinct swung open. The bullpen fell silent, every officer turning toward the entrance, expecting a stranger in an unfamiliar suit, someone new, someone whose face they'd never seen before. Instead, they saw Marcus. But not the Marcus they knew. Gone was the faded gray janitor's uniform, the rolling cart, the downward gaze. In its place stood a man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, a gold internal affairs badge clipped to his belt, his posture radiating the same quiet authority that had once commanded rooms full of military police investigators across 3 continents. Beside him walked Mayor Diane Whitfield's chief of staff and 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers. The room didn't just go quiet. It went.
Bennett's coffee cup slipped slightly in his hand, sloshing over the rim. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the man standing at the front of the bullpen with the man he had mocked, humiliated, and thrown a badge into the trash for just 12 hours earlier. "Good morning," the chief of staff said, stepping forward. "I'd like to formally introduce District 12's new internal affairs chief, Marcus Reed." The name landed like a thunderclap. A ripple of recognition swept through the room as officers exchanged bewildered, horrified glances. "That's," Bennett started, his voice barely a whisper. "That's the janitor." "Was," Marcus said, his voice calm, carrying easily across the silent room. "For the last 3 weeks, yes, I was exactly what you assumed I was. Quiet, invisible, beneath notice. That was the point." Pruitt's face had gone the color of old paper. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Marcus stepped further into the bullpen, his eyes sweeping slowly across the room, lingering for a moment on Bennett, then on Pruitt. "Some of you treated me with basic human decency these past 3 weeks, Marcus continued. "I remember that. Some of you did not. I remember that too." Marcus walked directly toward Bennett, stopping close enough that Bennett had to fight the urge to step back.
"You called me slow," Marcus said quietly. "You said I couldn't hold down a real job. You said I probably did time somewhere because a man who looks like me pushing a mop must have a criminal record instead of a career. You threw my badge in the trash and told me that's where I belonged." Bennett's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Sir, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus said, cutting him off, his voice never rising, which somehow made it more devastating than shouting ever could. "You didn't know, so you decided it was fine. You decided a man's worth could be measured by the job he appeared to be doing, and that gave you permission to humiliate him. You were right about one thing, Officer Bennett. I was watching. Every single night."
He reached into his jacket and produced a thin folder, sliding it onto the nearest desk.
Evidence room discrepancies going back 14 months. A pound of unaccounted narcotics from the Ramirez task force seizure. Falsified property logs. An envelope of unmarked cash I personally witnessed you place in your locker 11 days ago. The blood drained entirely from Bennett's face.
That's not... You can't just...
I can, and I have, Marcus said. Sergeant Pruitt? Pruitt's hand had already drifted toward the exit, a reflexive, panicked instinct.
Don't, one of the federal agents said quietly, stepping into his path. There's nowhere to go, Sergeant.
This is insane, Pruitt said, his voice cracking with desperation. You can't just walk in here after 3 weeks and... 3 weeks was enough, Marcus said. It usually is, once people stop paying attention to who's actually in the room with them. He turned to the chief of staff. I'll need Officer Bennett's badge and weapons secured immediately, along with Sergeant Pruitt's. Federal agents will begin securing the evidence room now. As agents moved through the bullpen, Bennett's hands shook as he unclipped his badge. His earlier bravado completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow terror of a man realizing the full scope of what he'd done, and who he'd done it to. Within hours, District 12 had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Federal agents moved through the evidence room with methodical precision, cross-referencing intake logs against Marcus's 3 weeks of documentation. What they found confirmed everything he had suspected, and more. The pound of missing narcotics from the Ramirez seizure connected directly to a string of unsolved cases across the county. Product that had clearly been resold through informal channels, the profits split among a small circle of officers, led, according to the ledger fragments Marcus had memorized, by Sergeant Pruitt himself. The corruption reached further than District 12's walls. Financial records pulled that afternoon revealed a connection to Captain Wallace Hendricks, who oversaw 3 precincts across the county and had for years quietly approved budget irregularities that made large-scale evidence discrepancies nearly impossible to trace through normal channels. Bennett, cornered in an interrogation room by federal investigators, initially tried to shift blame onto a younger officer, claiming he'd merely followed instructions from superiors without fully understanding what he was involved in. Officer Alvarez was in the building that night, Bennett said desperately. He probably saw more than I did. Ask him. But when investigators did ask Diego Alvarez, they found something Bennett hadn't anticipated. In the days following Marcus's dismissal, unsettled by everything he had witnessed, Alvarez had begun quietly documenting his own concerns, dates, times, brief notes about conversations he'd overheard, unsure what to do with them until now. I didn't know who to trust, Alvarez told Marcus directly, sliding a small notebook across the table. I just knew something was wrong. I should have said something sooner. Marcus studied the young officer for a long moment. You said something when it mattered most. That counts for more than you think.
The notebook, combined with the physical evidence and Marcus's own documentation, formed the backbone of a case that federal prosecutors described as one of the most thorough internal corruption investigations the county had seen in over a decade. The trial of Chad Bennett and Roy Pruitt became a landmark case in Ashford's judicial history, drawing local and eventually national media attention. Prosecutors presented Marcus's meticulous documentation alongside Alvarez's corroborating notes and the physical evidence recovered from the precinct's evidence room. The most damning moment came when prosecutors played a recording Marcus had captured weeks earlier, Bennett's own voice casually bragging in the locker room about handling a seized shipment before anyone noticed the discrepancy, laughing about how easy it was to alter a weight on a report nobody double-checked. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Bennett was convicted on charges of evidence tampering, narcotics trafficking, and falsifying official records, sentenced to 12 years in federal prison.
Pruitt, whose role as the operations organizer carried far greater weight, received 20 years for racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Captain Hendricks, implicated through financial records and testimony from lower-ranking officers eager to cooperate, resigned in disgrace and faced his own separate federal charges months later. In the aftermath, Mayor Whitfield announced sweeping reforms across the department: independent oversight of evidence handling, mandatory body camera audits, and a formal whistleblower protection program modeled directly on the very undercover strategy Marcus had used to expose the corruption in the first place.
Marcus Reed was formally confirmed as District 12's permanent internal affairs chief, tasked with rebuilding a culture that had been allowed to rot for years under the cover of silence and unchecked power. Months later, on a quiet evening after most of the precinct had gone home, Marcus walked the same hallway he had once mopped night after night, invisible to the men who worked alongside him without ever truly seeing him what had gone before. The building felt different now, lighter somehow, though he knew that feeling was as much about the people as the walls themselves. Officer Diego Alvarez, recently commended for his role in the investigation, passed him in the corridor and stopped. "Chief," Alvarez said, "I just wanted to say, what you did, sitting back, watching, staying quiet even when they treated you like garbage, I don't know if I could have done that." Marcus considered the question for a moment. "It was never about proving anything to them," he said. "It was about paying attention long enough to understand what actually needed fixing. Dignity doesn't require an audience, Officer Alvarez. It just requires you to hold on to it, even when nobody else recognizes it's there." Alvarez nodded slowly, something settling into place behind his eyes, the quiet resolve of a young officer who had learned, in the hardest possible way, what real integrity looked like. Marcus continued down the hallway alone, past the supply closet where his cart used to sit, past the evidence room now secured under new protocols, out through the same double doors he had once entered as an invisible man, carrying nothing but a mop and a mission. He hadn't done this for revenge. He understood now, more clearly than ever, that it had never truly been about Bennett or Pruitt as individuals. It had been about every citizen who had been failed by a broken system, every officer too afraid to speak up, every person who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or ignored simply because someone else decided they didn't matter. Justice, Marcus had learned over 20 years of quiet, patient work, rarely announced itself loudly. More often, it simply waited, invisible, overlooked, and underestimated, until the moment it was finally ready to be seen. True power was never about the uniform someone wore or the job title people assumed for them. It was about integrity in the moments nobody else was watching. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps this channel grow. Share it with someone who needs to see justice finally win. And subscribe, because next week, another story of karma and consequence is coming your way. See you in the next one.